He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't a politician. He was a 32-year-old father who packed one change of clothes, bought a bus ticket with money he couldn't afford to spend, and rode through the night to tell a billionaire that what she was doing to 60 families was wrong. She had power, lawyers, investors, and a deadline. He had stories. What happened inside that boardroom, and the one phone call that made the most powerful woman in the room go completely silent, is something nobody in that building has forgotten. If this story moves you, hit like and drop the name of the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. The eviction notice was printed on heavy cream paper, the kind that felt expensive between your fingers, and it had been slipped under Ethan Brooks's front door sometime before 6 in the morning on a Tuesday. He almost stepped on it. He was moving through the apartment in the dark the way he always did before his daughter woke up. Quietly, carefully, navigating the geography of their small space by memory. The lamp with the crooked shade near the couch. The stack of Lily's library books on the kitchen table that she kept meaning to return. The single sneaker she'd left in the middle of the hallway, which he'd already tripped over twice that week and kept forgetting to move. He was heading for the coffee maker when his sock hit the edge of the paper and sent it sliding a few inches across the linoleum. He picked it up without thinking much about it. Probably a newsletter from the building manager, he thought. Or a notice about the parking lot repaving they'd been promising since March. He set it on the counter, started the coffee, and stood there in the half-dark listening to the machine gurgle and hiss while the apartment slowly filled with the smell of something warm and ordinary. Then he read it. He read it twice, then a third time, slower, like the words might rearrange themselves into something that made more sense. Dear resident, this notice is to inform you that the property located at 4114 South Carpenter Street, Chicago, Illinois, has been acquired by Sinclair Development Group. As part of our ongoing redevelopment initiative, all current tenants are required to vacate the premises no later than 10 days from the date of this notice. 10 days. Ethan put the paper down on the counter. He looked at it. He picked up his coffee mug, realized it was still empty, set it back down. 10 days. He'd lived in this building for 4 years. He'd moved in 3 months after his wife left. Not dramatically, not in a way that made good stories, but slowly and then all at once, the way marriages sometimes go. She'd been unhappy for a long time, and then she'd been gone, and he'd been standing in their old apartment in Wicker Park with a 4-year-old daughter and a lease he couldn't afford, alone. He'd found this place through a coworker. It wasn't much. The radiators knocked in winter, and the elevator had been broken for most of last year, and the hallways smelled like whatever Mrs. Okafor on the 3rd floor was cooking, which was usually something with onions and spice that made his stomach growl every time he passed her door. But it was home. It was the only home Lily remembered. He walked down the hallway to her bedroom and pushed the door open a few inches. She was asleep on her side, one arm thrown over the edge of the mattress, her mouth slightly open. Her hair had come out of whatever braid she'd insisted on the night before and was spread across the pillow in a dark tangle. She looked completely peaceful in the way that only sleeping children can, fully committed to it, undisturbed by the world outside. Ethan watched her for a moment and then pulled the door mostly shut. He went back to the kitchen. He poured his coffee. He stood at the window and looked out at the alley behind the building. The dumpsters, the chain-link fence, the back of the dry cleaner across the street just beginning to show light in its windows. 10 days. By 8:30 that morning, the hallways of 4114 South Carpenter were louder than Ethan had ever heard them. He'd knocked on a few doors before taking Lily to school just to see if other people had gotten the same notice. They had. Every single one of them. When he got back from the school drop-off, the situation had evolved into something between a block party and a crisis meeting. People were standing in the hallway in robes and slippers, waving their notices at each other, talking over each other in 3 different languages. Mrs. Okafor from 3B had her notice in one hand and her phone in the other and was trying to reach someone at the city, navigating a hold queue that kept looping back to the same recording. The Vargas family from the ground floor, Domingo and his wife Carmen, who had 2 kids under 6 and had just renewed their lease in September, were standing outside their door looking like someone had punched them. Domingo kept saying he didn't understand. Carmen wasn't saying anything. Old Mr. Hessian from 2A shuffled out in his cardigan and asked Ethan if he could explain what was happening. Mr. Hessian was 74 years old and had lived in the building longer than anyone. He walked with a cane and his hearing had been going for years. And he didn't have family nearby, and he'd mentioned once over the summer that his pension didn't stretch as far as it used to. Ethan explained it as gently as he could. Mr. Hessian listened with his head tilted, processing it. 10 days, Mr. Hessian said. Yes, sir. That's not enough time. No, Ethan said. It's not. I don't know where I would go. Ethan didn't have an answer for that. He said he was working on it, which at that moment wasn't true, but felt like it needed to be said. He spent the rest of that morning making a list. Not a plan yet. He didn't have a plan, but a list of everyone in the building and what he knew about their situations. 12 units total, about 30 adults and a handful of kids. He knocked on every door that didn't open on its own. The picture that assembled itself was worse than he'd expected. Mr. Hessian, retired, fixed income, no family nearby. The Vargas family, 2 young kids, had just renewed their lease. Mrs. Okafor, 3 kids, worked double shifts at a hospital, was in the middle of a lease year. The Patels in 4C, their daughter Priya, had just started treatment for lymphoma, and the family was already buried in medical bills and had been for months. There was a young woman on the 5th floor, early 20s, name was Janna, who had moved out of a bad situation 8 months ago and was just starting to get herself stable. There were 2 older men on the 2nd floor, retired, who'd been neighbors for over a decade and had structured their lives around the proximity to each other. Every single unit was a different story, and every single story pointed to the same problem. 10 days was not a number that came from any calculation involving human beings. It was a number that came from a spreadsheet. Ethan sat at his kitchen table that afternoon with his list in front of him and a legal pad he'd pulled from a drawer. He started writing down what he knew. He'd looked up the company online, Sinclair Development Group, headquartered in New York, and he'd looked up the owner, Ava Sinclair, 30 years old. Forbes' profile from 2 years back called her one of the most aggressive real estate developers in the country. Started the company at 25 with money from a family trust and built it into something genuinely large and genuinely fast. A series of acquisitions in mid-sized cities, mostly residential properties that got flipped into commercial or luxury residential. The profile mentioned her 3 times, referring to her ability to move quickly and her low tolerance for delays. She was 30 years old. She owned 12 buildings in 6 cities and was apparently in the process of acquiring more. She had a legal team and a communications team and a finance team, and he was a 32-year-old man who managed inventory for a hardware distribution company and had a daughter who was going through a phase of collecting small rocks from every place she visited. He looked at the list of names on his legal pad. Mr. Hessian, the Vargases, Mrs. Okafor, the Patels. He folded the paper once and put it in his jacket pocket. He couldn't sleep that night. He lay on his back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and went through scenarios in his mind, the way you do when you already know what you're going to do but haven't fully admitted it yet. He could contact a tenant advocacy group. He could call the alderman's office. He could organize a petition. All of those things were reasonable and almost certainly too slow. There was one other thing. He hadn't thought about Senator Warren Callaway in almost 2 years. Callaway wasn't a family friend exactly. The connection was older and more specific than that. Ethan's father had spent 22 years as a mechanic in the Navy, stationed at Great Lakes for most of the back half of his career, and Callaway had been a young naval officer who'd come through twice during that time. They'd built a friendship the way men sometimes do in institutional settings, slowly, through proximity and reliability, the kind that doesn't require much maintenance but also doesn't disappear. When Ethan's father died of a stroke 4 years ago, Callaway had come to the funeral. He'd sat in the 3rd row, and he hadn't made anything about himself. Afterward, standing in the parking lot of the church, he'd given Ethan his personal cell number. Not his office number, his cell. "Your dad was one of the good ones," Callaway had said. "You need something, you call me directly. I mean it." Ethan had thanked him and meant to believe him and never called. He thought about calling now. He lay in the dark and thought about it. The senator sat on committees that had direct oversight over housing policy at a federal level. One call from Callaway to the right people could tie up Sinclair Development's permits and approvals in knots for months. One statement from his office could put the story in front of enough journalists that Ava Sinclair would have to answer for it publicly. It would work. It would probably work fast. But something about it sat wrong. He couldn't fully name why, lying there in the dark. Maybe it was that he hadn't earned it, or that it felt like dropping a boulder on someone before you'd even asked them to move. Or maybe it was something simpler than that. Maybe it was just that he wanted Ava Sinclair to hear the actual stories, to hear about Mr. Hessian asking where he was supposed to go, to hear about the Patels and their daughter's treatment schedule, to sit across from something human and look at it directly. Maybe she would anyway, and nothing would change, and he'd call Callaway from the bus on the way home. That was possible. That was actually the likely outcome if he was honest with himself. He fell asleep somewhere around 2 in the morning with his phone on his chest and the legal pad on the pillow beside him. He told his neighbor Donna, a woman in her early 50s who lived 2 doors down and had been a reliable presence in Lily's life since they moved in, the one who picked Lily up from school on the 2 days a week when Ethan's shift ran long, that he needed to be out of town for a couple of days. "What's going on?" Donna asked. She was standing in her doorway with her reading glasses pushed up on her head. "I'm going to New York to talk to the woman who bought the building." Donna looked at him for a moment. "And say what?" "Ask her to give people more time." "You think that's going to work?" "I don't know," he said, which was the honest answer. "But I can't just sit here." Donna looked at him for another long moment and then nodded. "Lily can stay with me. Don't worry about that part." He hugged her. She patted his back twice in the firm, slightly awkward way of someone who wasn't naturally a hugger but was making an exception. He packed a backpack that night. One change of clothes, a charger, his wallet, the legal pad with his notes, a granola bar he found in the bottom of the pantry. He printed out the building's tenant information, names, unit numbers, relevant circumstances, and folded it carefully and put it in the front pocket of the pack. He told Lily he had to take a short trip for work. "Is it a long trip?" she asked. She was at the kitchen table eating a bowl of cereal, swinging her feet. 2 days, maybe. You're staying with Donna." She seemed to accept this. Then she reached into the pocket of her hoodie and produced a small gray river stone, smooth on one side and rougher on the other, and put it on the table in front of him. "For luck," she said. He looked at the stone. He picked it up and put it in his jacket pocket next to the folded list. "Thank you, Bug." "Are you going to be okay?" "Yeah," he said. "I'll be okay." She looked at him for a moment in the way that 8-year-olds sometimes do, with a directness that adults tend to lose, and then went back to her cereal. He left the apartment at 11:30 that night to catch the midnight Greyhound. The bus to New York was 9 hours. Ethan had the window seat in the second-to-last row. The seat next to him was empty for the first few hours, and then taken by a heavy-set man in a Blackhawks cap who fell asleep almost immediately and snored intermittently for the rest of the journey. The interior of the bus smelled like old upholstery and the faint artificial pine of whatever cleaning product they used, and the highway outside was mostly dark except for the occasional long spread of lights from a rest stop or a town visible at a distance. He didn't sleep. He went through his notes for a while, though he'd already memorized most of them. He looked at the names, the stories, the small details he'd been careful to write down accurately. He thought about the meeting he was going to, which wasn't even a meeting. He hadn't gotten one. He'd called Sinclair Development's main number from a phone he borrowed from Donna, not wanting to use his own cell in case the call got logged somewhere, and had been told by a polite but brisk assistant that Ms. Sinclair wasn't available for unscheduled meetings, and that he could submit a request through the company's tenant affairs portal. He'd asked if there was any other option. "The portal is the appropriate channel," the assistant had said. So no, he didn't have a meeting. He had a bus ticket to New York and the name and address of the building and the general intention of not leaving until someone heard him out. He was aware this was not a plan. He was also aware that he didn't have a better one. He watched the dark, flat landscape of Indiana give way to the edge of Ohio and thought about what he was going to say if he actually got in front of her. He rehearsed sentences in his head and discarded them. He didn't want to sound like he was making a speech. He didn't want to sound angry, though he was. He wanted to sound like what he was, a person who knew the names of the other people in this situation and needed someone to know them too. At some point in Ohio, the snoring from the man next to him took on a rhythm that was almost soothing, and Ethan leaned his head against the cold window and looked at the highway lights smearing past, and thought about nothing in particular for a long time. He got into Port Authority at 8:50 in the morning. He used the bathroom, splashed water on his face, ate the granola bar standing at a trash can near the terminal entrance. Then he pulled out his phone and looked up the address of Sinclair Development Group's headquarters. 47th floor, Midtown. Of course. He took the subway. The building was the kind that announces itself with lobby architecture. Soaring ceilings, marble floors, a security desk that ran the length of a small apartment, staffed by 3 men in identical gray jackets. The lobby was filled with the particular kind of quiet that expensive buildings cultivate, the kind that tells you immediately that your presence is conditional. Ethan walked in wearing his worn gray jacket. He'd had it since his mid-20s. It had a small paint stain on the left cuff that he'd mostly gotten out, but not all the way. Carrying his backpack over one shoulder, he'd combed his hair in the bathroom at Port Authority. He was aware, acutely, of how he looked in this context, and he made a decision to not spend any energy worrying about it. He walked up to the security desk. "I'm here to see Ava Sinclair." The man at the center of the desk, mid-40s, professional, practiced at the art of polite discouragement, looked at him without any visible change in expression. "Do you have an appointment?" "No." "Miss Sinclair doesn't accept walk-in visits. Is there someone else who might be able to help you today?" "I'm a tenant at one of her properties in Chicago," Ethan said. "We received eviction notices 2 days ago, 10-day notice. I'd like to talk to her directly about it." "I understand, sir. That kind of inquiry would typically go through our tenant affairs team. I have the portal information," Ethan said. "I was told about the portal yesterday. I'm here in person because the timeline doesn't allow for the portal." The man looked at him, not unkindly exactly, but with the specific kind of sympathy that doesn't come with any intention to help. "I'll need to ask you to step aside while I make a call." "Of course," Ethan said. He stepped to the side of the desk. He put his backpack down by his feet and stood there. He waited for 40 minutes. He didn't pace. He didn't check his phone obsessively. He stood near a column off to the right of the security desk with his backpack at his feet and watched the lobby fill and empty with the morning foot traffic of people who had appointments and access badges and belonged here in a way he didn't. Several of them glanced at him in the fleeting way that people glance at something slightly unexpected in a familiar space. Not hostile, just registering the anomaly. At one point, a woman came down from the elevators and walked to the security desk and had a brief, quiet conversation with the man who'd spoken to Ethan. She looked in his direction once. He didn't look away. She went back to the elevator. At 9:52, the man at the desk gestured for Ethan to come back. "Someone will come down for you," he said. "You'll need to sign in and leave your bag with us." Ethan signed the visitor's log. He unzipped his backpack and took out his legal pad and the folded printout of his tenant information. He handed the bag over and held on to his papers. He took the elevator to the 47th floor. The conference room they put him in had floor-to-ceiling windows on one side looking out over Midtown. And on a clear morning like this one, the view was spectacular in an almost aggressive way. The grid of the city spreading out in every direction, the geometry of it, the sheer scale. Ethan sat down on one side of the table, a long dark surface that probably cost more than 6 months of his salary, and put his papers in front of him and waited. He was in there for 23 minutes before the door opened. Ava Sinclair was shorter than he'd expected from the photos. She came in with 2 other people, a man in his 30s with a laptop, who positioned himself slightly behind her and to the right, and a woman about the same age who sat directly across from Ethan. Ava sat at the head of the table. She was dressed in a way that was clearly expensive but not flashy. Dark trousers, a cream blouse, her hair pulled back. She looked like someone who operated at a pace that didn't allow for decorative details. She looked at Ethan with an expression that was neutral and not unkind and contained the particular quality of someone who has already categorized the situation and is simply processing it efficiently. "Mr. Brooks," she said, his name from the sign-in log. "Ms. Sinclair," he said. "Thank you for seeing me." You came from Chicago. Overnight bus. Something moved through her expression, not quite surprise, but a small adjustment. She looked at the papers in front of him. You're a tenant at Carpenter Street. 4114, yes. I've been there 4 years. I have an 8-year-old daughter. I'm aware there are families in the building, she said. Our team has been working on relocation resources. The notice gives 10 days, Ethan said. We're required to give proper notice under Illinois tenancy law. 10 days meets the legal minimum, Ethan said. Yeah, I know. That's not the same as being enough time. The woman across from him, he guessed she was legal the way she was positioned, made a small movement. Ava Sinclair's expression stayed level. What are you asking for, Mr. Brooks? 30 more days, he said. That's all. Give people 30 more days to figure out where they're going. The project timeline, I know you have a timeline, he said. I know you have investors. I'm not asking you to cancel the project. I'm asking you to move the start date by 30 days. He paused. Can I tell you about some of the people in the building? She looked at him. She looked at the papers in front of him. You have 5 minutes, she said. He opened the folded sheet. He talked about Mr. Hessian first. He talked about him clearly and specifically. Age, situation, the fact that he'd been in the building longer than anyone, that he walked with a cane, that his pension was fixed and not large, that he'd told Ethan he didn't know where he would go. He didn't editorialize. He just described. Then the Patels. Priya was 8, same age as Lily. She'd been diagnosed in January, was 6 months into a treatment protocol, had to be at Northwestern Medicine twice a week. The family had organized everything around proximity to the hospital. Moving in 10 days didn't just mean packing boxes. It meant finding a new place that met a very specific medical geography while also being affordable on a single income that was already being stretched by copays. He talked about the Vargas family, about Janna, who was 23 and had left a bad situation and had been slowly putting a stable life together, and for whom disruption of a specific and sudden kind carried a weight that wasn't just logistical. He talked about Mrs. Okafor, who had 3 kids and worked night shifts, and whose childcare arrangement depended entirely on her physical proximity to a neighbor who also lived in the building. He talked, and Ava Sinclair listened, and her expression stayed composed and professional, and he could not read what was happening behind it. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. I appreciate you sharing that, she said. Her voice was measured. And I want to be clear that this company takes its obligations to residents seriously. We've had our outreach team. Your outreach team sent a letter, Ethan said. He wasn't trying to be combative, but he also wasn't going to let that sentence stand unchallenged. That's not nothing, but it's also not 30 days. She looked at him directly. What you're asking would push our groundbreaking date into a period that affects our permit windows and our contractor availability. We have commitments to financial partners who, I understand, he said. I'm not saying it costs nothing. I'm saying it costs less than what it costs the people in that building. Another pause. The man with the laptop had been typing occasionally. He'd stopped. Ava Sinclair sat back slightly in her chair. The look on her face wasn't anger. It was something more like the expression of someone who has arrived at a decision they'd already been moving toward. I think we've covered the ground here, Mr. Brooks, she said. I appreciate you making the trip. Our team will continue to provide relocation resources and… Before I go, Ethan said, can I make a phone call? She looked at him. The question was odd enough to register. Here? Just one call. It'll take a minute. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite place. Something slightly curious, the way you look at an unexpected move on a chessboard. Sure, she said. Go ahead. He reached into his jacket pocket. He felt the smooth edge of Lily's stone for a second before he found his phone. He pulled it out and found the number. He'd saved it years ago and never deleted it, which was its own strange thing to notice, and pressed call and set the phone on the table. It rang 3 times. Then a voice said, Ethan, it's been a while. Senator Warren Calloway, clear as if he were in the next room. Ethan said, Senator, I'm sorry to call out of the blue. I'm in New York, sitting across from Ava Sinclair of Sinclair Development. She's developing a property in Chicago that I live in. We're residents, 60 of us, more or less, and we've been given 10 days to leave. I was hoping you might have a minute. I have a minute, Calloway said. Put her on. Ethan looked across the table at Ava Sinclair. She hadn't moved. Her expression had shifted into something he hadn't seen since she walked in the room, something that wasn't quite composure anymore. He slid the phone across the table to her. The man with the laptop had stopped typing again. The woman across from him was very still. Ava Sinclair looked at the phone. She picked it up. "This is Ava Sinclair," she said. And whatever Warren Calloway said to her next, Ethan couldn't hear. He sat back in his chair. He looked out at the skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the impossible scale of it, the gray and silver geometry of the city in the morning light. And he thought about Lily eating cereal at the kitchen table and the stone in his pocket and the list of names on the sheet in front of him. His part was done. The rest of it was up to her. The call lasted 4 minutes and 18 seconds. Ethan knew because he watched the timer on his phone's screen from across the table, the small digital counter ticking upward while Ava Sinclair sat with the phone pressed to her ear and said almost nothing. She said yes twice. She said, "I understand," once. Near the end, she said, "Of course, Senator," in a voice that had lost about half its professional steadiness. And then she set the phone face down on the table with the kind of careful deliberateness that people use when they need a second to collect themselves. Nobody in the room said anything. The man with the laptop had closed it at some point during the call. The woman who Ethan had pegged as legal was looking at a spot on the table approximately 6 inches in front of her. Whatever dynamic had been operating in this room before the phone rang, the quiet efficiency of it, the sense that everything had already been decided and this meeting was simply the formality of communicating that fact, had been replaced by something else. A stillness that felt like the moment after a door slams in a quiet house. Ava picked up the phone and slid it back across the table to him without quite meeting his eyes. "I need a few minutes," she said. "Of course," Ethan said. She stood, and the man with the laptop and the woman who hadn't introduced herself stood with her, and they left the room in the way that people leave a room when they have things to say to each other that are not for the visitor's ears. Ethan sat alone at the long table. He looked at his papers. He looked at the view. He thought about whether he'd done something wrong. Not morally. He'd thought about that on the bus and made his peace with it, but tactically. There was a version of this where the call landed so hard that Ava Sinclair's back went up and she dug in out of pure reflex, the way people sometimes do when they feel cornered. He didn't know her well enough to know which way she'd go. He got up and stood by the window. 47 floors down, the street was a stream of yellow cabs and pedestrians and delivery trucks moving with the particular organized chaos of Midtown Manhattan on a weekday morning. From up here, it had a kind of rhythm to it, like watching something from far enough away that the individual parts dissolved into a pattern. He thought about the street he'd grown up on in Bridgeport, the way it smelled in summer, the sound of it. He thought about Lily and whether she'd remembered to bring her gym shoes today, because Thursday was gym day and she had a tendency to forget. He pulled the rock out of his jacket pocket and turned it over in his palm. The smooth side was cool, the rough side faintly gritty. He put it back. 22 minutes passed before the door opened. Ava Sinclair came back in alone. She sat back down at the head of the table, but this time she didn't have the two people flanking her, and the positioning of it was different. Less like a board meeting, more like two people in a room. She had a bottle of water she hadn't had before, and she opened it and drank from it and set it on the table. She looked tired in a way that hadn't been visible when she'd walked in earlier, or maybe it had been there and he just hadn't been looking for it. "Sit down," she said. Not harshly. He sat. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he was having trouble reading. It wasn't anger. It wasn't warmth. It was something more careful than either. "How do you know the senator?" she asked. "He was friends with my father, Navy." "Your father, he passed away 4 years ago." She absorbed this. "And Calloway gave you his personal number." "At the funeral," Ethan said. "He said if I ever needed something, to call directly." "You've never called him before?" It wasn't a question, but he answered it anyway. "No." She looked at the table. She turned her water bottle a quarter rotation. "He was very clear about his concerns regarding the project," she said, and there was something dry and slightly rueful in her voice when she said it, something that was almost, not quite, the beginning of something more human than the exchange had been so far. I imagine he was, Ethan said. He mentioned permit reviews, she said. Environmental impact assessments. The phrase community impact hearing came up. I didn't ask him to say any of that. She looked at him. I know. The room was quiet for a moment. The thing is, Ava said, and then she stopped. She looked at the papers in front of him, his folded printout, the legal pad with his notes. The thing is, I've done 63 of these acquisitions, 63 properties in 8 years. And every single time there's a version of this conversation, someone with a story about why the timeline should change, why their situation is the exception. And most of the time the stories are real. I know they're real. But if I make an exception every time there's a compelling story, then there is no timeline. There's no project. There are no commitments I can actually keep. I understand that, Ethan said. Do you? I ran a floor of a distribution warehouse for 6 years, he said. I know what it means to have people counting on a schedule. I'm not asking you to blow up your project. I asked you for 30 days. 30 days on a project this size is 30 days. I know it costs you something. I'm not pretending it doesn't. He paused. But I sat in that building for 2 days after those notices went out, and I watched what it did to people. Mr. Hessian, I told you about him. He sat in the hallway with his cane for 2 hours on Tuesday because he couldn't figure out where to start. He's 74. He's been in that building since I was in grade school. He doesn't have people to call. She was listening. He continued. And the Patels, the family with the daughter in treatment, the father, Vikram, he came and knocked on my door Tuesday night at 10 o'clock to ask if I knew of any apartments that were close enough to Northwestern that they could still make her appointments. He had a notebook. He was writing things down. His daughter is 8 years old and has lymphoma, and he's sitting at a stranger's kitchen table at 10 at night trying to figure out hospital geography because your company gave him 10 days. He paused. He wasn't angry. That was the worst part. He was just methodical, like he'd already accepted it and was just trying to survive the next step. Ava was looking at him steadily. Something had shifted in her expression. Not dramatically, not the way it would shift in a movie, but in the small way that things shift in real rooms with real people when something gets through. You said there are about 30 adults in the building, she said. 28, plus 11 kids. And the woman you mentioned, Janna, 23. She moved out of a situation where someone was hurting her. She's been in the building 8 months. She found work nearby. She's doing well, relative to where she was. He paused. Moving is hard for most people. For her, it's not just hard. Ava was quiet for a moment. She put both hands around her water bottle without drinking from it. The project groundbreaking is scheduled for the 28th, she said. Moving it 30 days affects our contractor schedule and our permit sequencing. I know. The financial structure of this acquisition has a fairly narrow operating window. I know. She looked at him. You don't know, actually. You know in a general way, but not the specifics. You're right, he said. I don't. What I know is that the people in that building are real people with specific problems, and 10 days doesn't solve them. She sat back. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. Not dramatically, not theatrically, just the way people look at the ceiling when they're thinking through something that doesn't have a clean answer. Why didn't you call him first, she asked. Callaway? Before you got on a bus. Why come here at all if you had that option available? Ethan had thought about this. Because I wanted you to hear it directly, he said. Before anything else. Before any leverage or pressure or political whatever. I just wanted to sit across from you and tell you who was in that building and see if that was enough. And when it wasn't, then I called him, Ethan said. But I wanted to try it the other way first. She looked at him. The expression on her face was complicated, and he couldn't fully decode it, but there was something in it that felt different from the composed, efficient woman who'd walked in at the beginning of this meeting. A small fracture in the surface of it. Not weakness, something more like the beginning of a different kind of engagement. I need to make some calls, she said. Okay. I'm not making you any promises. I know. You should know that the senator's intervention, if it turns into a formal process, creates problems for everyone. Not just us. I understand that too. She looked at him for another moment, then she stood. There's a cafe on the second floor. Go get something to eat. You look like you haven't slept. I slept a little on the bus, he said. Go get something to eat, she said again, not unkindly. He gathered his papers and picked up his phone and his backpack. They'd returned it at the elevator, and he followed her to the door. She turned left toward the cluster of offices at the far end of the floor. He turned right toward the elevator. The cafe on the second floor was small and clean and served the kind of coffee that came with a price tag that Ethan briefly considered before ordering it anyway, because he hadn't eaten since the granola bar at Port Authority, and it was now past noon and he was running on something between adrenaline and stubbornness. He found a table by the window and sat down with his coffee and a turkey sandwich he'd grabbed from the display case, and he ate slowly and let the morning decompress a little. He texted Donna, "Still in New York. Things are in motion. Lily, okay?" The response came back in under 2 minutes. "She's fine. Made me watch 4 YouTube videos about rocks at breakfast. How'd it go?" He thought about how to answer that. "Don't know yet," he typed back. "Ask me tonight." He sat there for a while after he finished eating, just watching the lobby through the glass. People moving in and out, the security desk, the revolving door churning people in and out of the building with the indifference of a machine. He thought about Ava Sinclair. He'd expected. He wasn't entirely sure what he'd expected. Something more impenetrable, maybe. Someone easier to file under a single description. The profile he'd read had described her as aggressive and decisive. And she was both of those things. But there were other things in the room too. She'd listened. Not performatively. Actually listened, in the way you can tell because the questions that follow are specific and connected to what you actually said, not to a general version of what the person expected you to say. She'd asked about Janna specifically, by name. That meant she'd been paying attention. He wasn't sure it would matter. He wasn't sure that paying attention and making a different decision were the same thing, but it was something. He pulled out his legal pad and wrote down the approximate timeline of the morning because he had a tendency to lose detail when he was tired, and he wanted to be able to report back to the people in the building accurately, whatever happened. He'd been sitting there for about an hour and 40 minutes when his phone rang. An 800 number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Brooks," said a voice he recognized as the man with the laptop. "Miss Sinclair is ready for you." The room she was in this time was smaller. Not the big boardroom with the view, but a working office off the main corridor, cluttered with papers and 2 laptops open to different screens and a whiteboard along one wall that had a diagram on it. He didn't try to read. It felt like where the actual work happened, as opposed to where the formal versions of things happened. Ava was standing at the whiteboard with a marker in her hand when he came in. She looked like she'd been on her feet for the last hour and a half, which she probably had. "Sit anywhere," she said without turning around. He sat in the chair closest to the door. She capped the marker and turned around and sat on the edge of the desk. She looked at him with the same careful expression he'd been trying to read all morning. "Here's what I can do," she said. "Not what I'm committing to yet. What I can do. I can push the groundbreaking by 21 days. Not 30, 21. That keeps us inside the permit window and allows the contractor to reroute some preliminary work to another site during the delay. It costs us real money on financing, and it means some very uncomfortable calls to our investors, which I'll make personally." She paused. "I can also allocate a portion of our relocation budget. We have one, it's standard, toward targeted assistance for the residents in your building specifically, the families you mentioned, medical logistics, first and last month's rent support, that kind of thing." Ethan looked at her. 21 days, he said. 21. He thought about it. Not theatrically, he actually thought about it. 21 days was not 30. It was better than 10. It was better by a meaningful margin. And for some people in the building, the Vargases, Janna, some of the others, it might be the difference between a manageable crisis and an unmanageable one. For Mr. Hessian, it was harder to calculate. 21 days was still not a lot of time to rebuild a life. But combined with actual financial help finding a place, the relocation assistance, he said. How specific are we talking? Because for the Patels, what they need isn't just money. It's someone who can help them locate and vet apartments within a specific geographical range from Northwestern. That's a time-consuming process for a family that's also managing a treatment schedule. She looked at him with something that was almost, not quite, amusement. Not at him. More like at the situation, or at herself in it. "You've thought about this more than I expected," she said. "I've been thinking about it for 2 days," he said. "Fair enough." She nodded once. "I can assign a dedicated relocation coordinator from our team for that family specifically. Someone who knows the city and can do the legwork. And Mr. Hessian. Same. Janna, the young woman I mentioned, she needs something lower profile. Not a coordinator showing up at her door. More like a direct contact she can call. Someone she can control the pace with." Ava looked at him for a moment. "You know your neighbors very well," she said. "I've been their neighbor for 4 years," he said. "You learn things." She was quiet for a moment. Something moved across her face that wasn't easy to name, something that sat between professional assessment and something older and less categorizable. 21 days, she said again, and the relocation package expanded the way you're describing. That's what I can do right now, today, without going back to my board. "I need to ask you one more thing," Ethan said. She waited. "When this building becomes whatever you're turning it into, can any version of it include anything affordable? I know that's not your typical model. I know it might not be structurally possible. But there's a neighborhood there. There are people who have been in that neighborhood for a long time and who are going to get pushed further and further out if every building that goes up is priced at a level they can't reach." He paused. "I'm not asking you to run a charity. I'm asking you to think about it." She looked at him. It was a long look. Not the practiced professional one, but something more genuine, more uncertain, which in a strange way made it more trustworthy. "That's outside the scope of today," she said. "I know." "I'm not saying no," she said. "I'm saying that's a different conversation." "Okay," he said. She stood up from the edge of the desk. "I'll have my team draft the specifics and send them to you by end of business today. I need a contact for you. Your actual phone, not— I used a different phone to call your main line," he said. "Didn't want the call flagged." She looked at him. "That was deliberate?" "I figured calling from an unknown number was better than calling from the number that was about to be associated with a tenant dispute." Something crossed her face that was definitely amusement this time, brief and controlled, but real. "That's actually not a bad instinct," she said. He gave her his cell number. She wrote it on a sticky note on the desk. "Mr. Brooks," she said as he stood to leave. He looked back. "I want to be honest with you," she said. "What happened in that room this morning? The phone call. That's not something I react well to, normally. Being leveraged, I don't—" She stopped, reformulating. "I'm doing this because of what you told me about those people, not because of Warren Calloway. I want you to understand that." He looked at her. He believed her, which surprised him a little. "I know," he said. "How do you know?" "Because you asked about Janna by name," he said. "Someone who's just managing a pressure situation doesn't do that." She held his look for a moment. Then she looked away, down at the whiteboard, at whatever she'd been mapping out before he came back in. "Get some sleep on the bus," she said. "You look terrible." "Thank you," he said. "For the record, that's the nicest thing anyone said to me today." He walked out into the corridor. The elevator opened almost immediately, which felt like a minor mercy. He rode it down 47 floors and walked out through the marble lobby and through the revolving door into the noise and cold of Midtown Manhattan and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the scale of the city land on him. He took out his phone. He called Donna. "Well," she said. 21 days, he said, "and money for relocation, and someone's going to help the Patels find an apartment near the hospital." A pause on the other end of the line. "Ethan, it's not everything," he said. "It's not perfect, but it's something real." "It's a lot more than nothing," Donna said quietly. "A lot more." He stood there on the sidewalk with people moving around him in all directions, the city carrying on in the way it does regardless of whatever private thing has just happened to you, and he thought about the building on South Carpenter, about Mr. Hessian in the hallway with his cane, about Vikram Patel's notebook, about Lily eating cereal and putting a rock on the table. He hadn't fixed everything. He knew that. 21 days was still a deadline, still an ending, Still the beginning of a displacement that was going to be hard for every single person in that building. But he had walked in with nothing, no appointment, no credentials, no leverage he was willing to use first, and walked out with something real. He'd done what he'd come to do. He looked up the next bus to Chicago on his phone. There was a 7:15 departure from Port Authority. He had a few hours to kill. He started walking. The 7:15 bus pulled out of Port Authority 40 minutes late because of a mechanical issue with the rear door that a technician spent 35 minutes diagnosing and ultimately resolved by securing it manually with a bungee cord, which did not inspire enormous confidence but also did not stop anyone from boarding. Ethan had a window seat again, different side of the bus this time, and he sat down with his backpack between his feet and watched the Lincoln Tunnel swallow the bus whole, the tile walls sliding past in the yellow light. And then they were under the river, and then they were through it. And the city was behind him, and the highway opened up into the flat dark of New Jersey. He fell asleep before they hit the turnpike. It wasn't good sleep. It was the shallow, fragmented kind that happens when you're too tired to stay awake, but too wound up to actually rest, full of half-formed thoughts that kept reassembling into the same images. The conference room. Ava Sinclair's face when she'd picked up the phone, the lobby guard watching him stand by the column for 40 minutes, Mr. Hessian in the hallway with his cane. He kept surfacing from it and then going back under, and when he finally came fully awake, it was past midnight and the bus was somewhere in Ohio and his neck hurt from the angle he'd been sleeping at, and his mouth tasted like old coffee. He sat up and stretched as much as the seat allowed and looked out the window at the dark. A water tower went by. Then a lit sign for a gas station. Then nothing for a while. He checked his phone. 2 texts from Donna. One from 9 p.m. asking if he was on his way. One from 10 saying goodnight, that Lily was asleep, that everything was fine. A missed call from a number he didn't recognize, Chicago area code. And an email. He almost missed it scrolling through, from a domain that said sinclairgroup.com, sent at 7:48 p.m. He opened it. It was from someone named Rachel Cho, Senior Manager of Resident Relations, Sinclair Development Group. The email was direct and professional and 3 paragraphs long. It confirmed what Ava had said in the office. The new vacate date was now 32 days from the original notice, which put it at 42 days total from when the notices had been delivered. It outlined the relocation assistance package, a fund of $3,000 per household, plus a dedicated coordinator available by phone and in person for residents requiring more specific help. It named the Patel family specifically, noting that a coordinator with knowledge of Chicago's medical district geography had been assigned to them directly. It included a phone number and an email for Janna's low-profile contact option, described only as a resource line with no company branding, designed for discretion. At the bottom, in a separate paragraph that read slightly differently from the formal tone of the rest, it said, Ms. Sinclair asked me to include that she welcomes any follow-up questions you may have and that her direct line is available to you for that purpose. Please find it below. Ethan read the email twice. Then he put his phone in his jacket pocket and sat in the dark of the moving bus and looked out at the highway lights. 32 days from the original notice, plus the assistance package. It was more than he'd asked for. He wasn't sure when she'd added the extra 11 days to the 21 she'd offered him in the office. Maybe in one of the calls she'd made that afternoon. Maybe it had been in the math all along and she'd been testing what he'd accept. It didn't matter. What mattered was the number on the page and the name of the coordinator assigned to the Patels, and the quiet acknowledgement, in corporate language, that Janna deserved to be handled differently from everyone else. He thought about her. About Ava Sinclair sitting in that cluttered working office with the whiteboard, turning options over. He didn't think she was a villain. He hadn't gone to New York thinking she was one, which was maybe part of why the meeting had gone the way it did. She was someone who had built something fast and hard, and who had learned at some point in that process to move through human complications the way you move through traffic, acknowledge them, navigate around them, keep the pace. The complication this time had a name. 12 names, actually. 39 if you counted the kids. He closed his eyes. This time when sleep came, it was deeper and quieter, and it held. He got back to Chicago at 6:20 in the morning. The bus station smelled the way it always did. Diesel and old food and the particular staleness of a public building that never fully empties. and he stood outside on the sidewalk in the early cold with his backpack and breathed in the city air, which was not clean but was familiar in a way that felt, after 2 days of other people's cities, like something close to relief. He took the L home. The train was mostly empty at this hour. A night shift worker asleep across 2 seats, a woman with a cleaning company uniform reading something on her phone, a teenage kid with enormous headphones staring at the ceiling. The city moved past the windows in the gray early light, the rooftops and water towers and the backs of buildings that faced the tracks, the fire escapes and the satellite dishes and the patches of graffiti and colors that looked faded in the morning. He got off at his stop and walked the 6 blocks to Carpenter Street. The building looked the same. Of course it did. It had been 2 days, but there was something about coming back to a place after a concentrated period of difficulty that makes you see it differently, the way you notice the weight of a door when you're carrying something. He stood on the sidewalk in front of it for a moment. Red brick, slightly worn at the corners. The first-floor windows with their different arrangements of curtains. Mrs. Okafor's blue ones, the Vargas's white ones, a pulled shade on the unit that had been empty for months. The cracked concrete of the front stoop with the iron railing that wobbled slightly when you grabbed it. He'd lived here 4 years. He'd moved in when he was broke and lost and didn't know what the next version of his life was going to look like. He'd built something here piece by piece, the way people do when they don't have the luxury of grand plans, through routine and proximity and small accumulated reliabilities. Donna, 2 doors down. Mrs. Okafor's cooking smell on Thursday nights. Mr. Hessian in the lobby sometimes, slow with his cane, but always willing to talk, always curious about what Ethan's week had been. He went inside. The hallway was quiet. It was barely past 7. He went up the stairs, and on the 2nd floor he passed Mr. Hessian's door and stopped. He stood there for a moment. Then he knocked, lightly, in case the man was still asleep. There was a pause, longer than you'd expect, and then the shuffle of movement inside and the click of the deadbolt, and the door opened to reveal Mr. Hessian in a robe and slippers, his white hair uncombed, blinking against the hall light. He looked at Ethan for a moment. "You're back," Mr. Hessian said. "Just got in." "Did you—" He stopped. He looked at Ethan's face, reading it the way older people read faces, carefully and without rushing. "Did it go all right?" 32 days from when the notices went out, Ethan said. "That's 6 more weeks total, plus money for relocation, someone who will help you find a place." Mr. Hessian stood in his doorway for a moment without saying anything. His hand was on the doorframe and he was gripping it, not for balance exactly, but in the way of someone who needs something solid nearby. 6 weeks, he said. "Yes, sir." The old man exhaled slowly through his nose. He looked down at the floor of the hallway and then back up at Ethan, and his eyes were wet, which he didn't try to hide or address. "I'll put coffee on," he said. "I've got to check on Lily," Ethan said. "But tonight, if you want." "Tonight," Mr. Hessian agreed and nodded once and closed the door. Donna opened her door before Ethan could knock. She must have heard his footsteps in the hall, and stood there in her bathrobe with her arms crossed, and looked at him the way people look at someone who has been through something and come back from it. "You look like garbage," she said. "Good morning to you, too." "Is she—" She stopped before finishing, tilting her head toward the interior of the apartment. "Still sleeping," Donna said. "She had some kind of rock identification project until 10 last night. I had to confiscate it." He almost laughed. "Can I—" "Go ahead." He went through Donna's apartment to the small guest room at the back, the one with the yellow curtains that Lily had decided she liked specifically because of the color. The door was cracked. He pushed it open. Lily was asleep in essentially the same position she was always asleep in. On her side, arm over the edge of the mattress, mouth slightly open. She'd added a new development. She was wearing her backpack, not with things in it, apparently, just wearing it over her pajamas, strapped over both shoulders, like she'd been prepared to go somewhere in her sleep. Ethan stood in the doorway and looked at her for a long time. He crossed the room and crouched down next to the bed and put a hand lightly on her arm. She stirred, made a sound, opened one eye. "Dad?" "Hey, Bug." She blinked, looked at him. Then she reached out and grabbed his wrist with both hands. "You're back," she said. "I'm back." "Did it work?" He thought about how to explain it to an 8-year-old, the complexity of it, the 21 that became 32, the relocation package, the quiet acknowledgement in a corporate email that people like Janna deserved something different. How do you translate that into language that fits the shape of what she'd asked? It worked, he said. Not all the way, but enough. She seemed to accept this as a reasonable answer. She let go of his wrist and settled back into the pillow. Donna made me turn off my rock project, she said, in a tone that conveyed the injustice of this clearly. 10 p.m. is late for a rock project. It was important. We'll do it tonight, he said. Get some more sleep. She closed her eyes. He stayed crouched next to the bed for another minute, one hand on her arm, and let the quiet of the room be exactly what it was. He slept 4 hours in his own bed and then woke up at noon with the particular clarity that comes after the kind of sleep your body actually needed. He showered and changed and ate actual food, eggs and toast, standing at the kitchen counter, and then he sat down at the table with his phone and his legal pad and started making calls. He called Mrs. Okafor first. She picked up on the second ring, and he could hear the hospital background, the PA system, the distant squeak of shoes on a polished floor. So he kept it brief. New timeline, 32 days, assistance money, a coordinator. She was quiet for a moment and then said, in a voice that was working to stay even, that she had to go and she would call him back. She called back 40 minutes later on her break and talked for 20 minutes, not all of it coherent, cycling between relief and anger and practical questions, and something that kept breaking through the surface and that Ethan recognized as the specific emotional response of someone who had already started preparing for the worst and was now having to disassemble that preparation. I told my sister I might need to move in with her, Mrs. Okafor said. I told my kids we might have to change schools. My daughter cried. She's 9. I know, Ethan said. 32 days is still not a lot of time. It's not, he said. It's better than 10. Yes. A pause. Yes, it is. Another pause. Thank you, Ethan. I mean it. Thank you. He called the Vargases next. Carmen answered, and when he told her the news, there was a sound on the other end that he could only describe as something releasing, a breath that had been held since Tuesday morning finally let go. She said she needed to call Domingo, and would he please hold on, and there was a stretch of muffled conversation in the background, and then Domingo got on the line and said, Mr. Brooks. Okay, good. In the slightly disjointed way of a man absorbing information that contradicts what he'd been preparing for, not quite convinced yet that it was real. The money too? Domingo said. The relocation help. That's real? It's in writing, Ethan said. I'll share the email with you. Okay, Domingo said again. Okay. Vikram Patel didn't answer his phone, but he responded to a text within 20 minutes with a message that read, Ethan, I just saw this. Can we talk? I'm at Northwestern with Priya. Can call in about an hour. He called 90 minutes later from what sounded like a hospital corridor, speaking quietly so as not to carry. When Ethan told him about the coordinator who'd been assigned specifically to their family, who knew the medical district geography and would do the legwork on apartment proximity, there was a silence on the other end that lasted long enough that Ethan said, Vikram, to check if the call had dropped. I'm here, Vikram said. Sorry, I'm here. His voice had changed registers, tighter, higher, the way voices get when someone is trying to hold something in a public space. Can you say that again about the coordinator? Ethan said it again. Another silence. My wife keeps saying we'll find something, Vikram said. I keep making lists. She's better at the optimism than I am. He paused. Priya asked me this morning if we were going to have to move before she finished treatment. I told her no. I said it before I knew it was true. He cleared his throat. Now maybe it's closer to true. Ethan didn't say anything for a moment. There wasn't really anything adequate. I'll send you the coordinator's contact information today, he said. Her name and direct line. Call them, tell them exactly what you need. I will, Vikram said. Thank you. He stopped. Thank you. Janna was the hardest call to make, Not because he expected a bad reaction, but because he'd thought the most carefully about how to approach it. He'd met her a few times in the hallway, and once at the mailboxes, and she was the kind of person who was watchful in a way that told you something about what she'd learned from the world. Not hostile, not closed off, just careful. He'd noticed she always stood slightly angled toward the door, any door, with a quality of attention that wasn't paranoia exactly, but was related to it. He texted her first. "This is Ethan from 2C. I have news about the building situation. Good news. No rush, but let me know if you want to talk." He set his phone down and gave it an hour before trying anything else. She texted back in 45 minutes. "Yeah, okay, I'm around." He knocked on her door rather than calling. That felt right for some reason. She opened it on the chain first, just a sliver, the way you do when you're being careful, and then took the chain off and opened it fully and stood in the gap with her arms crossed, not defensively but in the way of someone who was cold or guarded against something they couldn't fully name. She was small, early 20s, dark hair, wearing a flannel shirt over a tank top. She had the specific watchfulness he'd noticed before. "Hey," she said. "Hey, I wanted to tell you in person." He kept his voice even, conversational. "The timeline changed. We have more time, 32 days from when the original notice went out. And there's help available, not a coordinator showing up at your door. A private contact line, just a phone number you can call when you want to, on your schedule." She looked at him. She uncrossed her arms. 32 days, she said. "Yes." "How?" It wasn't quite a question, the way she said it, more like an acknowledgement that something had happened and she was trying to understand what kind of thing it was. "I went to New York and talked to the woman who bought the building," Ethan said. She listened. Janna looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read. It wasn't gratitude exactly, or not just gratitude. It was something more complicated, the look of someone trying to determine whether a piece of information was safe to believe yet. "Why'd you do that?" she said. "I mean, why'd you make the trip?" He thought about it. "Because the 10 days wasn't fair," he said. "And I know the people in this building." She looked at the floor for a second. When she looked back up, her expression had shifted slightly. Something had moved in it, something small and genuine. "Okay," she said. 32 days. That's..." She stopped. "That's something." "Yeah," he said. "It is." She took the piece of paper he'd written the resource line number on. She looked at it and folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of her flannel. She started to say something and then seemed to change her mind. "Thanks, Ethan," she said. He nodded. She closed the door. He stood in the hallway for a moment and then walked back toward his own apartment. By 4 in the afternoon, he'd spoken to or left messages for every household in the building. He'd shared the email from Rachel Cho with everyone who wanted to see it in writing. He'd answered the same questions multiple times. What does the assistance money cover? Who is the coordinator? Is this legally binding? With the same patient accuracy, because these were people who had every right to ask and who had been given little reason over the previous days to assume that anything was going to go in their direction. By 5, he was sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and a legal pad that was now covered in notes on both sides of 3 pages, and he was tired in a way that was different from the bus ride tired. Slower, lower, the kind that comes after the adrenaline of a thing stops, and you're left with just the reality of what actually happened and what it cost. He thought about what it had cost. 2 nights of bad sleep. 1 bus ticket each way that he'd put on a credit card he'd been trying to pay down. 2 days of emergency childcare from Donna, which she'd refused any payment for and which he'd have to find a way to repay in kind. The cold feeling in the back of his throat that had been there since Tuesday morning every time he thought about Lily and the building and what would happen if this hadn't worked. It had worked. Partially. In the imperfect, negotiated way that things work in real life, where you ask for 30 and get 32, and the 32 comes with conditions and riders and a timeline that is still, at the end of it, a deadline. His phone buzzed on the table. An unknown New York number. He picked it up. "Mr. Brooks?" Ava Sinclair's voice. "I wanted to make sure you received Rachel's email." He blinked, slightly surprised. He'd expected her to process whatever had happened between them through intermediaries going forward. "I did," he said. "Thank you." "Well, I added the additional days after you left," she said. "The 21 I offered wasn't actually the ceiling. I had room for 11 more, and I should have said that instead of waiting to see if you'd take less." He sat with that for a moment. It was an odd thing for her to say, a kind of honesty he hadn't anticipated. "Why are you telling me that?" he said. A pause. "Because you came in without leverage and tried to talk to me like a person first," she said. "And I didn't return the courtesy. I gave you the lower number because that's how I negotiate, not because it was the honest answer." Another pause. "I'm telling you because it seems like the kind of thing you'd want to know." He thought about what to say to that. In the end, he said, "I appreciate it." "I know this isn't over for the people in your building," she said. 32 days is better. It's not enough." "No," he agreed. "It's not." "I've been thinking about what you asked," she said, "before you left, about the building, what it becomes." He waited. "I'm not making any promises," she said, "but I've asked my development team to look at what percentage of the units could carry an affordability covenant and still make the project viable. It's a question I should have asked at the beginning of this acquisition and didn't." Ethan sat in his kitchen in the late afternoon light and held the phone and didn't say anything for a moment. "Thank you," he said. Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "The numbers might not work. The investors have expectations and I have commitments, but I'm looking at it." "That's enough," he said. "That's more than you had to do." There was a pause on the line, not an awkward one, more like the pause at the end of something that doesn't have a clean concluding line. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Brooks," she said. "You too," he said. The call ended. He set the phone down on the table. He looked at the kitchen, the crooked lampshade visible through the doorway to the living room, Lily's library books still on the table, the single sneaker that was still in the middle of the hallway because he'd still never moved it. He picked up the sneaker and put it by the door where it belonged. Then he heard the sound of Donna's door down the hall and Lily's voice in the corridor, animated and loud the way she was after school, describing something in the specific detail that only mattered to her, and he went to his front door and opened it, and she came through it at full speed and wrapped both arms around his waist and pressed her face into his jacket. "You smell like a bus," she said, muffled. "I've been on 2 buses in 2 days." She pulled back and looked up at him. "Did it really work?" He looked at her. "It really worked. Not perfectly. But really." She considered this. "Can we do the rock project now?" "Yes," he said. "We can do the rock project now." The next 3 weeks had a different quality than anything that had come before them. It wasn't peaceful exactly. Peace wasn't really available in a building full of people facing displacement, regardless of how much time they'd been given, but it had a direction to it now, a forward momentum that the first terrible week of the eviction notice had completely lacked. People were moving, not out yet, but towards something, making calls, visiting apartments, filling out applications, having the kinds of conversations with their kids that parents dread and do anyway because there's no alternative. Ethan became a kind of informal coordinator, which wasn't a role he'd sought or announced, but which assembled itself around him through proximity and the fact that he'd gone to New York and come back with something. People knocked on his door with questions. He answered the ones he could and found answers to the ones he couldn't. He forwarded the email from Rachel Cho to every household that wanted it, which was all of them. He shared the coordinator's number and the resource line and walked Mrs. Okafor through the relocation assistance application twice because the first time the website had frozen and lost her progress, and she'd slammed her laptop shut in frustration. He was doing this while also working full days at the distribution warehouse because his bills were still his bills and nothing about the situation had changed that. He was also looking for a new apartment for himself and Lily, which was its own particular project. A 2-bedroom, reasonably close to her school, in a neighborhood that was neither so rough he'd be up at night, nor so expensive he'd be drowning. He had a spreadsheet. He hated the spreadsheet. It was a record of everything wrong with every option he'd looked at, which was a dispiriting document to add to every evening. Lily had accepted the situation with the adaptability that children sometimes demonstrate when the adults around them are honest about what's happening. He'd sat down with her the night he got back from New York and told her they were going to have to find a new apartment. He'd told her it would be okay. She'd asked if they could get a place with a bigger window so she could get a plant. He'd said yes, they could definitely try for a bigger window. She'd gone back to her rocks. He didn't know if she was really okay or if she was performing okay for him, the way kids sometimes do when they can feel an adult's anxiety and try to reduce the pressure of it. He watched her more carefully in those weeks, looking for signs of something beneath the surface, and what he found was harder to interpret than distress would have been. She was a little quieter at dinner sometimes. Once he found her sitting on her bedroom floor with the door nearly closed, not doing anything, just sitting there looking at her bookshelf, and when he pushed the door open, she looked up at him with an expression that was too old for her face. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "Then, do you think the new place will have a fireplace?" "In an apartment in Chicago? Probably not." She nodded. "Okay." She went back to looking at her bookshelf. He stood in the doorway for a moment and then went back to his spreadsheet. Met. The Patels were the first family to find a new place. The coordinator from Sinclair Development, a woman named Gloria Chen, 30-ish, brisk, and practical in a way that communicated genuine competence rather than just efficiency, had called Vikram the day after Ethan shared her contact information, and within 72 hours she'd assembled a list of 6 two-bedroom apartments within a mile and a half of Northwestern Medical, all within the Patels' budget, all available within the relevant window. It was the kind of logistical work that would have taken Vikram weeks doing it alone in notebooks at people's kitchen tables at 10 p.m., and having it done for him seemed to dismantle something in him, some load-bearing structure of tension that had been holding everything else up. He came and knocked on Ethan's door on a Thursday afternoon. "We found a place," he said. 2 bedrooms, 2nd floor, 13-minute walk from the hospital. He said it flatly, not excited exactly, like he was still waiting for the floor to drop out from under the information. "That's good news, Vikram," Ethan said. "It's a good apartment," Vikram said. "It's actually a good apartment." He said it like he was still surprised. "Gloria found it. She called the landlord before we even visited and told him about Priya's situation and asked him directly if the family would be allowed flexible lease entry for medical appointments. He said yes. She got it in writing before we saw the place." "Good," Ethan said. "I didn't know people did that," Vikram said. "I didn't know you could just ask for that and have someone do it." "You usually have to know to ask," Ethan said, "or have someone who knows." Vikram looked at him. "Priya drew a picture of our new apartment," he said. "She hasn't seen it yet. She just drew what she imagines it looks like. There's a cat in it." "Are you getting a cat?" "No," he said, "but I'm starting to think we might have to reconsider that position." It was the first time Ethan had heard Vikram Patel make anything resembling a joke in the months since the notices went out, and the specific sound of it, tentative, wry, the humor of a man daring to breathe again, was one of the better sounds Ethan heard in those weeks. The Vargases found a place in the 3rd week. It was slightly farther from their kids' school than they'd wanted, which meant renegotiating the morning logistics, but it was in the same school district so the kids could stay. Carmen cried when she called Ethan to tell him. He heard Domingo in the background saying something to her in Spanish, his voice low and steady. The specific register of a man talking his partner through something that was simultaneously a relief and a grief. Because finding a new apartment when you didn't want to leave your old one is always both things at once. Mrs. Okafor had a harder time. The combination of her income, her required proximity to the hospital where she worked, and the number of children she had narrowed the options significantly, and the options that existed were not good. Ethan spent 2 evenings at her kitchen table going through listings with her. Her oldest daughter, 12, sat at the far end of the table doing homework and pretending not to listen. And the 2 younger kids moved in and out of the room with the chaotic energy of children who are processing disruption through constant motion. "There's nothing I can afford that's close enough," Mrs. Okafor said. She was not a person who stated facts dramatically. She delivered them in the same direct, practical tone she used for everything, which somehow made the flatness of the statement worse. "If I go farther out to find cheaper, I add 40 minutes to my commute each way, which means I need different childcare, which costs more, which means I need to go farther out. You see the problem." "What about Section 8? Ethan said. "Wait list," she said. I've been on it for 2 years. The assistance money from Sinclair, $3,000, plus whatever the coordinator can find, is a first and last month deposit, she said, which helps. But it doesn't change the monthly math. He sat at her table and looked at the spreadsheet she'd built, which was more detailed and more rigorous than his own, with columns for distance, rent, commute time, child care adjustment cost. The numbers were honest. They didn't work. He went home that night and sat in his kitchen and thought about it. He had a number in his jacket pocket, Ava Sinclair's direct line, the one that had been included in Rachel Cho's email, and he had not used it. He'd been deliberately not using it, keeping the channel available for genuine necessity rather than wearing it out on things he could solve other ways. He thought about whether this qualified. He thought about it for 2 days. On the second day, he called. She picked up on the third ring. Mr. Brooks. I have a situation with one of the residents, he said. Mrs. Okafor, 3rd floor, 3 kids. Works nights at a hospital. The math doesn't work for her. The assistance money helps, but the monthly picture is what it is, and I'm trying to figure out if there's anything else available. A pause. What would help? An extended stay in the building while she looks, he said. Past the 32 days, 4 to 6 weeks more. Enough time to find something that actually makes sense rather than something that's just technically available. Another pause. He could hear her thinking, or at least he could hear the quality of the silence that corresponds to it. I need to talk to the contractor, she said. The demolition phase has a sequence. There are units that come down first. What floor is she on? 3rd. Give me until tomorrow morning. She called back the next day at 8:47. The 3rd floor units are in the 2nd phase of demolition, she said. There's room in the schedule to allow 3rd floor occupancy for an additional 5 weeks beyond the current vacate date. I'll need a formal exception filed with the contractor, which creates some administrative friction, but it's manageable. Thank you, Ethan said. Tell her 5 weeks, Ava said. Not 5 weeks and a day. The contractor window doesn't flex after that. Understood. Mr. Brooks, she said. Then she paused. You're going to run out of favors to call in at some point. I know, he said. I'm trying to be careful about it. I know you are, she said. That's why I keep picking up. Another pause. Shorter. How are your own plans coming? He almost laughed, not in a performative way, but in the way of genuine surprise at the question. Still looking, he said. The market's bad. Chicago's Wicker Park corridor has several new mid-range buildings coming online in Q2, she said. I happen to know the developers. He held the phone. Are you offering to help me find an apartment? I'm offering to make an introduction, she said. A name and a number. What you do with it is your business. He thought about whether to accept this. He turned it over for a moment, testing it against some internal scale he couldn't entirely articulate. Send it to me, he said. I'll reach out. I'll have Rachel send the contact today. The call ended. He stood in his kitchen in the morning light and thought about the strange arc of the last few weeks. The eviction notice on the linoleum, the overnight bus, the 40 minutes standing beside a column in a marble lobby, the phone on a conference table, the gradual, imperfect, real thing that had assembled itself out of all of it. Mrs. Okafor took the news of the extended time with a composure that he recognized as the kind that holds a lot of other things underneath it. She nodded. She said, All right. She said it again. Then she said she needed to make a call and she'd talk to him tomorrow, and when he saw her the next day in the hallway, she stopped and gripped his arm briefly. Not a hug exactly, more like the specific physical acknowledgement of someone who communicates the things words can't cover through touch, and then let go and continued down the hall. She found a place in the 4th week of her extension. It was not perfect. It was a longer commute than she'd wanted. The kitchen was smaller than her current one, and the building didn't have the particular neighbor geography she'd built her childcare system around. She called Ethan and described it with the measured, matter-of-fact tone she used for things she'd fully processed before speaking. It's not what I have here, she said. No, he said. But it's workable, she said. It's actually workable, and the school is good. A pause. My daughter hasn't cried about it since she found out about the school. That's something. That's a lot, actually, Mrs. Okafor said. You'd be surprised how much that is. Janna was the one Ethan worried about most, in the way you worry about people who give you less information to work with. She'd taken the resource line number and folded it into her pocket, and he hadn't heard from her for nearly 2 weeks after that. He resisted the impulse to check in too often. She was an adult, she had the information, and hovering would communicate something he didn't want to communicate. On a Tuesday evening in the 3rd week, she knocked on his door. He opened it. She was standing in the hall in her flannel shirt, backpack on, and she looked like someone who had been doing math in her head for several days and had arrived at a number she could live with. "I found a place," she said. "Yeah?" "It's in Logan Square. Smaller than this. The building has a front desk." She said the last part with a weight to it that he understood. "That's good," he said. "The woman I talked to on the resource line helped me with the application," Janna said. "I didn't know how to... There's this thing where you have to explain gaps in your rental history, and I didn't know how to do it without saying too much. And she told me how to frame it." She paused. She was good. The person on the line. "I'm glad." Janna shifted the backpack on her shoulder. She looked at him with the careful directness she always had, the eyes-on-you quality of someone who trusted slowly and measured the results. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "Why did you specifically tell them I needed a low-profile contact? How did you know to say it that way?" He thought about it. "Because you always stand near the door," he said. "Whichever door you're near." She looked at him. Something moved through her expression. Complicated, a little exposed, and then steadied. "Okay," she said. "I just wanted to know if it was obvious." "Only if you're paying attention," he said. She nodded. Then she said, "Thank you." And it was a different kind of thank you from the one she'd said in the doorway 3 weeks earlier. That one had been careful and contained. This one was smaller and more direct and came from somewhere deeper. "You took care of yourself," he said. That's what mattered. She went back down the hall. He stood in his doorway for a moment and then went back inside. Mr. Hessian was the last. Ethan had been checking in with him every few days. Coffee in the evening, usually, in Mr. Hessian's apartment that smelled like old wood and something Ethan had never been able to identify. Something slightly sweet and herbal that might have been a pipe he didn't smoke anymore, or a tea he'd stopped making, or just the accumulated olfactory residue of a particular life lived in a particular set of rooms. The old man's apartment was full of things that told his story in the way only long-term homes can. The way objects accumulate when you stop performing tidiness for company and just let a space become what it is. A Navy photograph on the wall, 2 men in uniform squinting against the sun, one of them clearly a young Hessian. A shelf of paperback novels with cracked spines. A ceramic bowl on the table that held a collection of mismatched buttons, which Ethan had never asked about but always noticed. A chair by the window that was slightly more worn than everything else, shaped by the specific weight of one person over a long time. The coordinator, Gloria, had been in contact with him and had found 3 options within his budget, all with elevator access, all within a reasonable distance from the VA clinic he used for his health appointments. He'd looked at 2 of them in the 2nd week. He'd looked at the 3rd in the 3rd week, Ethan driving him since Gloria was unavailable that afternoon. The 3rd apartment was in a building about 12 blocks south and slightly west. It was a senior-friendly building. Elevator, intercom, a common room on the ground floor that Mr. Hessian had inspected with skeptical interest before noting that the television was mounted at a reasonable height, which he seemed to consider a meaningful positive. The apartment itself was a 1-bedroom, smaller than his current place, 2nd floor. It had a window that faced a small courtyard with a tree in it that was just starting to show the early suggestions of spring. Mr. Hessian stood at the window for a long time. "There's a tree," he said. "There is," Ethan said. "I've had a tree outside my window my whole life," Mr. Hessian said. "Every place I've ever lived. I thought that was going to end here." He said it in the tone of a man noting a practical fact, not trying to make it into more than it was. He turned from the window and looked at the room. He looked at the ceiling, the floor, the walls. He did this the way people do when they're testing a space against some internal image. Not the image of the new place, but the image of the old one, comparing dimensions and light and the specific geography of a life. "It's smaller," he said. Yes, but it's all right, he said. He didn't say it cheerfully. He said it with the measured honesty of someone who has been through enough to know the difference between what they want and what they can work with. It'll be all right. He took the apartment. In the final days before the vacate date, the building changed its character the way buildings do when the end of them is close. Boxes appeared in hallways. The dumpster in the alley behind the building filled and was emptied and filled again. People started taking things off walls, leaving pale rectangular ghosts behind on the paint. The sound of the building shifted, furniture being moved across floors, voices through walls carrying the specific cadences of packing and leaving and the conversations that accompany them. Ethan packed his own apartment with Lily's help, which was occasionally helpful and frequently not, since she had opinions about everything and a compulsive need to examine each item as it came out of drawers and off shelves. "Why do you have 3 spatulas?" she asked on a Saturday afternoon, holding them up in a fan. "I don't know. We only need 1. "You're right. Can I keep one in my room?" "Why would you keep a spatula in your room?" She considered this. "For emergencies," she said. "No." She put 2 of the spatulas in the donate box with the manner of someone making a reasonable concession and kept one, which she put in her own box of things, and he chose not to make it a fight. He'd accepted Ava Sinclair's introduction. The contact she'd sent, a developer named Mark Ellison, who was bringing a mid-rise online in early spring on the near north side, had responded to his email within a few hours and had been direct and practical in a way Ethan appreciated. The building wasn't luxury, but it was new construction with working appliances and a 2-bedroom that was within Ethan's range by a margin that was not comfortable but was real. The unit had a window in the 2nd bedroom that faced east, and east-facing windows got morning light, and morning light in a kid's room was something he'd stored in his mind as a priority since the day Lily was born. He signed the lease on a Wednesday. Lily asked to come to the signing and sat in the rental office chair swinging her feet while Ethan initialed pages, and on the way out she asked if they could go get pretzels, which they did. Standing on the sidewalk outside the pretzel place, in the thin gray light of a Chicago afternoon in early March, Lily held her pretzel with both hands and looked at it with the expression of serious consideration she applied to things she found genuinely worthwhile. "Is this a celebration pretzel?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "I think it is." "Okay," she said. She took a bite. She chewed and swallowed and looked up at him. "Dad?" "Yeah." "When we move, can we go visit Mr. Hessian sometimes, at his new place?" He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "We'll do that." "And Mrs. Okafor's kids? Maybe Sophia and me could still see each other." "We'll figure it out." She went back to the pretzel. He stood next to her on the sidewalk and ate his own and thought about the building. Not with the heavy feeling he'd expected, but with something more complicated than that. Not nostalgia yet, not grief, something still in the process of becoming one of those. The building had been a place he'd come to when he had nothing, and it had given him not nothing. The people in it, the accumulated small texture of a shared space, Mr. Hessian's Sunday mornings and Mrs. Okafor's cooking smells and Donna's reading glasses pushed up on her head and Lily growing from 4 to 8 in rooms that knew the shape of her. You couldn't carry a building with you, but the people who'd been in it, those moved differently. His phone buzzed, a text from a number he recognized now, the 212 area code of Ava Sinclair's office. The affordability study came back. Numbers are tight, but not impossible. Getting pushback from 2 investors. Haven't decided yet. As. He read it twice. He typed back, "Appreciate you telling me. Whatever you decide, the fact that you asked the question is something." Her response came quickly. "That's a generous way to look at it. I've been trying to get better at that," he typed. A pause. Then, "So have I." He put the phone back in his pocket. He looked at the street, the familiar grid of it, the buildings, and the parked cars and the sky above the rooftops, the particular shade of late winter gray that he'd always found more honest than it was beautiful. Lily had finished her pretzel. "Ready?" he asked. "Yep," she said, and took his hand. They walked back toward the building, not the new one yet, the old one, the one he still lived in for 11 more days, through the cold and the noise of the city, and Ethan thought about the word ready and what it meant and how rarely people were ever fully it and how you went ahead anyway, because that was the only direction available. The last day in the building wafts a Saturday. Ethan had planned it that way deliberately. He had arranged for the moving truck to come at 9 in the morning, which gave him the entire day without having to take time off work. And it gave Lily the weekend to settle into the new place before school on Monday. He told himself this was pure logistics. It probably was, but there was also something in the choice of a Saturday that he recognized as instinctive, the way you instinctively choose to end something in a moment that doesn't feel borrowed from the middle of an ordinary week. He was up at 5:30, not because of the alarm was set for 6:15, but because his body had developed the habit over the past month of waking him before it needed to, like it was keeping watch on something. He made coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the dark, in the apartment that was no longer his apartment in any functional sense. The walls bare, the shelves empty. Everything he owned either in boxes stacked by the door or already moved to the new place in a preliminary trip he and Donna had made midweek with her car and his carload of the fragile things. The kitchen table was still there because it was going in the truck. The coffee maker was still there because it was the last thing he always packed. The lamp with the crooked shade was already gone, which meant the kitchen was lit only by the ceiling fixture, and without the lamp the room looked different, colder, more structural, the way rooms look when the things that made them particular to one person have been removed. He sat with his coffee and looked at the wall where Lily's height marks were. He'd been doing this for 4 years, standing her against the door frame between the kitchen and the hallway, pencil mark, date, initials. 4 years of her growing, documented in a column of small lines. He'd been trying to figure out for 2 weeks what to do about this. You couldn't take a door frame. You couldn't photograph a mark and have it mean the same thing. He'd bought a piece of wood, a plain pine board from the hardware store, and last week he'd carefully transferred each mark to it. The measurements, the dates. LB, age 4, September. All the way up to the most recent one, LB, age 8, January. The board was wrapped in brown paper and packed flat between the mattresses and the moving truckload. It wasn't the same as the door frame, he knew that, but it was the thing that existed instead. He finished his coffee. He washed the mug, dried it, put it in the box by the sink. Then he went down the hall, not to Lily's room. She was still asleep. He could hear her. But to the front door, which he opened quietly, and out into the building hallway. It was silent. The early morning stillness of a place that wasn't fully awake yet. He walked down the hall, past Donna's door with its small wreath that had been there since December, past the unit that had been empty for months, to the stairwell at the end. He went down to the first floor and stood in the lobby for a while. The lobby was nothing special. It never had been. Linoleum floor, a row of metal mailboxes along one wall, a bulletin board with a fire evacuation plan, and a faded flyer for a neighborhood watch meeting from 2 years ago. The elevator doors, which had been out of service for most of last year and had been working again since November, like they'd waited until the building was almost over before remembering how. He stood there in the quiet and tried to do the thing people tell themselves they'll do in departing moments and rarely succeed at, really seeing a place. Not the ideal of it, not the nostalgic version that starts assembling itself the moment you decide to leave, but the actual thing. The scuff marks on the lower part of the wall that had been there since before he moved in. The slight lean of one of the mailbox doors that never fully closed. The smell, which he'd described to himself once as institutional and had stopped noticing within a week of moving in, and which he now noticed again with the hyper-awareness of someone who understands they won't be smelling it much longer. He heard footsteps on the stairs. Mr. Hessian came around the corner slowly, cane in hand, wearing the same cardigan he'd been wearing the morning Ethan told him about the eviction notice. He stopped when he saw Ethan. "Couldn't sleep either," the old man said. "Not really. Mister." Hessian came and stood next to him. They both looked at the lobby for a moment, two men standing in a space that was about to stop being theirs. "My movers come at 11, Mr. Hessian said. "Mine at 9. "I've been in this building 21 years, Mr. Hessian said. He said it without drama, without the weight that someone younger might put on it. Just as a fact, offered into the silence. "I moved in when I was 53. I thought it would be temporary. Most things you think will be temporary aren't. How do you feel about the new place? Ethan asked. I don't know yet, Mr. Hessian said honestly. It's a good apartment. It has a tree outside the window. I keep reminding myself about the tree. He paused. It's not this. But most things aren't this until they've had time to become it, and then they are. Ethan looked at him. That's a generous way to think about it. I'm old, Mr. Hessian said. I've moved enough times to know that a place is mostly just the people in it, and the people can come with you if you choose to let them. He paused. You're going to keep visiting. I told Lily we would. Good. He nodded once, with the satisfaction of something confirmed rather than promised. I want to see her rock collection when she has it properly organized. That might be a while, Ethan said. Organization isn't her strong suit. She's 8, Mr. Hessian said. She has time to develop it. He reached out and put his hand briefly on Ethan's arm, the gesture of a man who'd spent his life in institutions where emotional expression was practical and unadorned. You did a good thing. What you did for this building. I know it didn't fix everything, but you did a good thing. Ethan didn't have a ready answer for that. He nodded. They stood in the lobby a little longer, not saying anything, which was comfortable in the way that silence between people who know each other well can be. Then Mr. Hessian said he was going to go start his last pot of coffee in his own kitchen, and he shuffled back toward the stairwell, and his cane made its soft, deliberate tap on each step going up. And then it was quiet again. Bas. The movers arrived at 8:57, 2 men named Daryl and Kevin who worked with the efficient and slightly bored competence of people who'd done this 1,000 times. Lily stood in the doorway of her empty bedroom and supervised the removal of her furniture with the gravity of a small official at an important function. Be careful with that one, she said, pointing to her dresser. It has a loose drawer. We got it, Kevin said, which was probably true. Donna came at 9:15 with coffee in a thermos and stood in the hallway watching the parade of boxes with an expression that she was working to keep neutral. Are you going to cry? Lily asked her. No, Donna said. Your face looks like you might. My face is cold, Donna said firmly. It's March. Lily accepted this explanation and went back to supervising. Ethan pulled Donna aside while Kevin and Daryl were navigating the couch down the stairwell. I want to say something, he said. If you're about to thank me again, I'm going to pour this coffee on your shoes. Donna, I mean it. You picked Lily up from school twice a week for 4 years, he said. You kept her for 2 nights when I was in New York. You drove a carload of my fragile things across the city without complaining. The lamp with the crooked shade poked me in the ear the whole way, and I still haven't complained, she confirmed. You're one of the best people I know, he said. She looked at him. Her expression did the thing she'd accused her face of doing earlier. The working to keep neutral thing losing slightly to something warmer and more honest. You're going to be 15 minutes from here, she said. You're not moving to another country. I know. So stop talking like this is a funeral, she said. Give me a hug and let's get this furniture in the truck. He hugged her. She hugged back, properly this time. None of the twice on the back courtesy of the first one. She smelled like coffee and the specific cedar hand lotion she always used, and he thought, not for the first time, about how the sensory details of people are the things you carry longest. How you can forget the exact shape of someone's face over time, but remember the smell of their coat without trying. 15 minutes, she said again, against his shoulder. 15 minutes, he agreed. The truck left at 11:40. Ethan did a final walkthrough of the apartment the way you do when you know you're leaving a place. Methodical, each room, opening closets, checking corners. There was nothing left. It never felt like nothing. It always felt like something that required checking anyway. He stood in Lily's empty room for a moment. The rectangle of slightly less faded paint on the wall where her bookshelf had been. The marks of sticker tape on the wall above where her desk had stood. The morning light through the window, east-facing, which he'd always liked. The way the sun came in low and strong in the early hours. He pulled the front door shut behind him and turned the key one last time and put it in the small envelope he'd been given for returning it and slid it under the building manager's door on the ground floor. He walked out. The new apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like new paint and the neutral, slightly chemical scent of fresh carpeting. The elevator worked. There was an intercom. The hallways were wide and well lit. Lily stood in the doorway of her new room and was quiet in the way she got when she was taking in something large. It was bigger than her old room by a meaningful margin. The window faced east, morning light. "The window," she said. "Yeah," Ethan said. She went to it and pressed her face against the glass in the specific full-contact way she had of engaging with windows, leaving an oval of fog on the surface when she pulled back. Below was a quiet side street, a row of parked cars, a tree that was further along in its spring coming back than the ones downtown, visible buds, the early suggestion of leaves. "There's a tree," she said. He thought about Mr. Hessian, standing at his own new window 12 blocks south and slightly west, looking at his own tree. "Yeah," he said. "There is." She turned from the window. She looked at the room, her boxes stacked in the corner, her mattress against the wall, her dresser that Kevin and Daryl had been careful with. She looked at the bare walls. "Can I paint it?" she asked. "I'd have to ask the landlord," he said. "Yellow," she said. "Not bright yellow. Like a morning yellow." "I'll ask." She seemed satisfied with this. She went to her box of rocks, which had been the first thing she'd asked Daryl to bring up, before her dresser, before her books, a priority that he'd accepted without comment, and opened it on the floor and began the private and serious process of deciding where things would go in the new space. Ethan unpacked boxes for the next 4 hours. It was the kind of work that empties your head, which is probably why it's the work people do when they need their head emptied. The physical grammar of it, lift and unwrap and place and decide. The slow reassembly of a life in a different set of rooms. He found things he'd forgotten he owned. A book he'd been looking for since last spring. A photograph he'd thought was lost, from before Lily was born. Him and his father at a Cubs game. His father squinting against the sun in exactly the same way as the man in Mr. Hessian's Navy photograph. He looked at it for a long time and then put it carefully on the shelf that was going to be the bookshelf. At 3:30, Lily appeared in the doorway. "I'm hungry," she said. "There's nothing in the refrigerator yet," he said. "I know." She looked at him. "Pretzel?" He set down the box he was holding. "Yeah," he said. "Let's do pretzels." They walked to a vendor 6 blocks from the new building who operated from a cart on the corner with the particular permanence of Chicago street food, present in all weather, always busy, indifferent to everything except the transaction. Ethan got 2 with mustard. Lily got 1 with cheese, which she always called the good way, as if the existence of mustard were a personal offense. They sat on a bench near the corner and ate. The afternoon had the specific quality of Chicago in early March, when the season is starting to consider changing. Cold still, the air with an edge, but the light different than it had been in January. Longer, tilted differently, carrying the suggestion of something further off. People moved past them with the purposeful speed of people who were cold and going somewhere. A dog on a leash stopped to investigate Lily's shoes and was pulled away before any conclusion was reached. "Dad," Lily said. "Yeah. Are you sad?" He thought about giving her the parent's answer, the one calibrated to reassure, the one that carries just enough honesty to be credible. He thought about it and decided against it. "A little," he said, "not about the new place. The new place is good. More about leaving a thing that was good." She considered this while chewing. "Like when you finish a really good book," she said. He looked at her. "Yeah, kind of like that." "But then you can read it again," she said. "A building isn't quite like a book," he said. "You can't go back to a building the same way. But you can visit people from it," she said. "That's the good parts. The people are the good parts of the book." He held his pretzel and looked at his 8-year-old daughter and thought about Mr. Hessian in the lobby at 5:30 in the morning, saying a place is mostly just the people in it, and the people can come with you if you choose to let them. And he thought about the specific way wisdom sometimes announces itself through the most ordinary channels. "Yeah," he said. "You're right. The people are the good parts." She finished her pretzel. She examined the cheese residue on her fingers with scientific interest. "I want to visit Mr. Hessian soon," she said. "Next weekend," he said. I'll call him this week. And Sophia Vargas, she said. Sophia was Mrs. Okafor's 9-year-old, who Lily had developed a friendship with over the past 2 months of building crisis proximity that children build faster than adults because they don't require the preliminaries. I'll talk to her mom. Lily seemed satisfied. She stood up from the bench and wiped her hands on her jacket, which was exactly the kind of thing Ethan had given up correcting, and looked up at the sky. Gray, high clouds, the city against it. New place is good, she said. It wasn't a question. New place is good, he agreed. She took his hand, and they walked back. Symptom. 3 weeks after moving day, Ethan got an email. It was from Ava Sinclair's personal address, not the Sinclair Development domain, her personal one, which was just her name and a number. The email was short. It said that after 2 weeks of back and forth with her investor group, she had reached an agreement. 12% of the units in the new Carpenter Street development would be deed-restricted affordable housing, priced at 30% of area median income for a period of 15 years. It was not the 30% she'd initially hoped to put to the board. It was not nothing, she wrote. The two investors who pushed back hardest eventually agreed when I pointed out the reputational math. I'm not certain whether that makes it the right reason for the right outcome or the wrong reason for the right outcome. I've been thinking about that. She ended with, the building breaks ground in 8 days. I thought you should know. He read it 3 times. Then he wrote back, I think the right outcome is the right outcome, regardless of the reason it got there. The 15 families who live in those affordable units in 2 years won't ask why. They'll just live there. He paused. Then he added, thank you for doing the math, even when the math was hard. Her response came the next morning. My father used to say that the measure of a business wasn't what it built, but who it built it for. I spent a long time deciding that was naive. I'm still not sure it isn't, but I'm less sure than I was. He read that and thought about it for the rest of the morning. He thought about his own father, the photograph on the shelf, the Cubs game, the squint against the sun, the man who'd spent 22 years fixing engines on Navy ships and had somehow, in the course of that long plain life of maintenance and service, made a friend who became a senator and who still had his number 30 years later. He thought about what his father would make of the past 6 weeks. He thought he'd probably nod and say something short and not particularly profound, because that was the kind of man he'd been, and then he'd ask if Lily was eating enough vegetables. He smiled at that, the specific private smile of a memory that belongs only to the person remembering it. He put his phone in his pocket and went to pick Lily up from school. What? He visited Mr. Hessian the following Saturday, as promised. The building was quiet and clean, the elevator worked, and the common room on the ground floor had a television mounted at a reasonable height. Mr. Hessian answered the door in his cardigan and led him into the apartment with the practiced hospitality of a man who had decided to be at home in a new place and was doing the daily work of that decision. The apartment was smaller. He'd made it his own with the same objects: the Navy photograph, the paperback shelf, the ceramic bowl of mismatched buttons on the table. The chair by the window was positioned toward the courtyard, toward the tree, which from the second floor you could see properly, the whole crown of it, just beginning to come into its spring. Mr. Hessian made coffee. They sat at the small kitchen table and talked the way they always had. Not about anything dramatic, just the conversation of two people who had been through a thing together and were now on the other side of it, comparing notes on ordinary life. The building has a chess club, Mr. Hessian said, with a tone that suggested he had not yet decided whether this was a positive development. Are you going to join? I'm considering it. A pause. The man across the hall plays. We talked in the elevator twice. He seems reasonable. That's a strong endorsement from you. I'm not impulsive, Mr. Hessian said. No, Ethan agreed. You're not. Mr. Hessian looked at him over his coffee cup. How are you? He said, and the way he said it was the particular how are you that means something more specific than the greeting version, the one that's actually asking. Better, Ethan said. We're settled. Lily likes the new school bus route. She's discovered the bakery 2 blocks from the building, which has complicated my budget somewhat. And you? Mr. Hessian said. Ethan looked at his coffee. I think I'm still catching up to myself, he said. The last 2 months happened fast. I keep coming back to things from it, things I didn't have time to process while they were happening. That's normal, Mr. Hessian said. I keep thinking about whether I did it right, Ethan said. The whole thing, going to New York, using Calloway when I said I wanted to try without him first, whether the 32 days was enough, whether the families are actually okay. Are they? Mostly, he said. The Patels are near the hospital. Vargases found a place. Mrs. Okafor is managing. She's tired, but she's always tired. Janna seems steady. He paused. I don't know if I did it right. I just know I did it. Mr. Hessian set his cup down. He looked at Ethan with the unhurried directness of a man who'd had 74 years to understand that most people need to be listened to more than they need to be advised. You know what I think? He said. I think the fact that you're still asking whether you did it right means you did it as well as it could be done. The people who do things badly don't usually lose sleep over the methodology. Ethan looked at him. Drink your coffee, Mr. Hessian said. He drank his coffee. Donna called him a month after the move. She'd had an offer on her own unit, not from Sinclair Development, from a different buyer who'd approached the building manager about 2 of the apartments, and she was considering taking it. Moving where? Ethan asked. Bridgeport, she said. There's a 2-flat available. My sister's been telling me to move back for years. I keep saying no, and she keeps being right. You don't? Mortgage, she said. But yeah, technically, my name on something. She said it with the specific combination of pride and terror that home ownership tends to produce in people who've rented their whole adult lives. That's good, Donna. I know. A pause. I wouldn't have thought about it if the building thing hadn't happened. I'd been comfortable there forever. Sometimes it takes someone blowing up your comfortable to make you look at what else is possible. He thought about that. You should tell Ava Sinclair that, he said. She'd probably find it extremely validating in a way that I wouldn't recommend you give her. Donna laughed, her real laugh, not the polite one, the one that was bigger and less contained. Are you two actually friends now? Because that's a strange friendship. I don't know what we are, he said. We text sometimes. She sends me things about housing policy. I send her back things about housing policy. It's mostly housing policy. That's the nerdiest friendship I've ever heard of. We're both very invested in zoning reform, he said. She laughed again. You're such a dad, she said. I mean that as a compliment. I know, he said. Thank you. On the day the demolition of 4114 South Carpenter Street began, Ethan was at work. He knew it was happening. He'd tracked the schedule because, of course, he had, but he'd made a deliberate decision not to go watch, and he'd stuck to it through the morning. He was at his desk at the distribution warehouse going through an inventory discrepancy when he got a text from a number he didn't immediately recognize. Groundbreaking today. Thought you should know I was there. A pause, then a second text. It's going to be a good building. I'm going to make sure of that. He looked at the texts, then he typed back, I know you will. He put his phone down and went back to the inventory discrepancy. At lunch, he stepped outside and stood on the loading dock behind the warehouse. The air smelled like exhaust and the faint green suggestion of spring, that specific Chicago smell in late March when the winter is releasing its grip incrementally, not all at once, testing to see if the season has actually changed. He stood in it for a while. He thought about what Donna had said. Sometimes it takes someone blowing up your comfortable to make you look at what else is possible. He turned it over. It wasn't a comfortable thought, because what had blown up the comfortable had also been frightening and unfair, and the people it had happened to hadn't asked for the growth opportunity embedded in it. The Patels hadn't needed a displacement experience. They'd needed stability while their daughter fought for her health. Mr. Hessian hadn't needed to rebuild his life at 74. Janna hadn't needed another thing to survive. And yet, the Patels were in an apartment 13 minutes from the hospital with a landlord who had their situation in writing. The Vargases were in a place that was less than ideal and was working. Mrs. Okafor was tired and stable and had found a school for her daughter that had her not crying. Janna was in a building with a front desk and a phone number she'd chosen to call on her own terms. Mr. Hessian had a chess club he was considering joining, and a reasonable man across the hall, and a tree outside his window. None of it was what any of them would have chosen. All of it was what they'd built out of what they'd been given, with whatever tools had been available, and now it was the new ordinary. And the new ordinary was the thing that became home. He went back inside. That evening he picked Lily up from school, and on the way home she asked if they could stop at the bakery. He said yes. She ordered a croissant, which was not a thing he'd ever seen her order before. She was historically a muffin person, and ate it with the careful deliberateness of someone trying a new thing they'd already decided they liked. "It's good," she said. "The croissant?" "The bakery," she said. "Like being able to go to it." She looked at him. "I didn't have a bakery before. At the old building, there was no bakery close." "The old place had other things," he said. "I know," she said, "but this place has the bakery." She said it with the philosophical acceptance of someone who has genuinely processed a trade-off. "Different doesn't mean worse." He looked at her. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. "Donna says it," she said. She texted me about moving to her sister's place." "Donna texts you?" "We have a group chat," Lily said. "Me, Donna, and Sophia. We're planning a visit." Ethan looked at his daughter. This 8-year-old person who had organized her own social infrastructure through a building dispersal, who had a group chat with an adult woman and a 9-year-old she'd met 2 months ago, who was eating a croissant outside a bakery in a neighborhood she'd been in for 4 weeks and had already made into something partially hers. He thought about what it meant to belong to a place. He'd been thinking about it for months, in the specific way that displacement makes you think about it, the way you only examine the nature of a thing when you're in the process of losing it. He'd thought it was about the physical location, the specific linoleum floor, the bullet-shaped mailboxes, the smell of the hallway. And it was those things. But it was also something that the linoleum and the mailboxes just happened to be the containers for. And when you took the containers away, what you found was that the thing itself was more portable than you'd believed. Lily finished her croissant. She looked up at him. "Dad," she said. "Yeah." "I put your stone on my bookshelf," she said. "The one I gave you for luck. I thought you probably didn't need it anymore since the luck thing worked, so I took it back." He blinked. "You went through my jacket?" "It was on the shelf by the door," she said. "The pocket was open." He looked at her. She looked back at him with the steady, slightly too direct gaze of a person who saw no procedural issue with any part of this sequence of events. "That's fine," he said. "I know," she said. They walked home. There is a particular kind of person who doesn't move through the world loudly, who doesn't announce their arrivals or catalog their sacrifices or position themselves at the center of the stories they're part of. Ethan Brooks was that kind of person, and it had never been a decision. It was just the shape of him, the way some people are. But here's what he did. He got on a bus with a backpack and a legal pad and a rock his daughter had given him, and he sat across from a woman who had everything and asked her to consider the cost of a decision she'd already made. And he did it without threats and without theater and without asking for anything for himself. And then he went home and made phone calls and knocked on doors and drove an old man to an apartment with a tree in the courtyard and taught a father how to ask a landlord to put something in writing. These are not grand gestures. They are not the things that get written up or remembered in the way that loud arrivals get remembered, but they are the things that determine whether a 74-year-old man knows where he's going and whether a 23-year-old woman who has already survived too much has a phone number she can control. And there is this about Ava Sinclair. She was not a villain, which is sometimes the most complicated thing a person can be. Someone doing real harm from a position of genuine competence and genuine intention. Someone who had learned to move so fast that the human cost of that speed had become a kind of background noise she no longer registered. It took a man in a worn gray jacket sitting across from her and saying names, not accusations, just names, to make the noise audible again. She didn't transform. She didn't become a different person. She became a version of herself that asked a question she should have asked at the beginning. That is not nothing. In the real world, in the actual texture of how change happens, it is rarely nothing. The building at 4114 South Carpenter broke ground on a Tuesday in late March. 12% of its future units would carry a 15-year affordability covenant. It wasn't 30%. It wasn't everything. It was the result of two investors being persuaded by reputational math and one woman deciding to run the numbers on a question she'd never asked before. 15 families in 2 years would move into those units. They wouldn't know the story. They wouldn't know about a man on a bus or a phone call in a boardroom or an old man asking where he was supposed to go. They would just unlock a door and carry their boxes in and start the long, ordinary work of making a place into a home. That is how most good things happen, not in the announcing of them, but in the living that comes after. Ethan didn't think of himself as someone who had done something significant. He thought of himself as someone who had known his neighbors well enough to say their names clearly to someone who needed to hear them. He thought the difference between those two things mattered. On the shelf in his new apartment, between a photograph of his father at a baseball game and a small stack of Lily's library books, there was a plain pine board wrapped in brown paper that he hadn't unwrapped yet. He was waiting until they painted Lily's room, the morning yellow she'd requested, which the landlord had agreed to after a 10-minute phone call. And then he was going to take the board out and put it in the hallway between the kitchen and her room and start the marks again. Same dates, same initials, different wall. That was the other thing about home. It wasn't a place you were given. It was a practice, a daily decision about what you were going to pay attention to and who you were going to show up for. It required nothing dramatic. It required only the ordinary willingness to know your neighbors' names, to knock on a door, to board a bus with a backpack and a piece of paper, and the modest but unshakable conviction that the people on your list deserve to have someone say them out loud. Ethan Brooks was not a hero. He was just a man who knew where he lived. That turned out to be enough.